Death Rides the Ferris Wheel by Catherine Waltan. Chapter 1. Ribbons and Rumors. The Maplewood County Fair arrived the way summer storms always seem to, sudden, electric, and impossible to ignore. One moment, Helen Lighthall was deadheading roses in her garden, enjoying the drowsy hum of afternoon bees, and the next she was standing in her driveway, car keys in hand, watching Halo and Shadow practically vibrate with anticipation at the sight of their leashes. "All right, boys," she said, unable to suppress a smile as Halo's entire body wagged. "I suppose retirement does mean saying yes to more adventures." The drive to the fairgrounds took her through the heart of Maplewood, past the bakery she'd owned for 23 years, now sporting a cheerful new coat of yellow paint under its current owners, and along Maple Street, where every porch seemed to flutter with the pastel ribbons that meant fair season had officially begun. Children pressed their faces to car windows, pointing at the Ferris wheel visible above the tree line, its sherbet-colored gondolas already turning lazily against the deepening sky. Helen parked in the grassy overflow lot, breathing in air thick with promise and the mingled scents of her childhood summers. Caramel corn, sizzling onions, the green smell of trampled grass, and something indefinably magical that only happened when hundreds of people gathered to forget their troubles for a few hours. As she clipped the dog's leashes, a memory surfaced, herself at 8 years old, clutching her father's hand as they approached this same fair, her heart hammering with the delicious terror of the tilt-a-whirl. The sensation was so vivid she could almost feel his calloused palm against hers, smell the Old Spice cologne that meant safety and Saturday adventures. Funny how some places never change, she thought, watching Halo immediately investigate a discarded popcorn container while Shadow stood alert, scanning their surroundings with the focused intensity of a bodyguard. The fairgrounds spread before them like a living, breathing carnival painting. Strings of bulbs outlined every ride and game booth, blinking in patterns that would have given her migraines in her younger days, but now seemed merely festive. The Ferris wheel dominated the center of it all, 60 feet of pastel perfection, turning with mechanical precision, its riders' laughter drifting down like confetti. Helen felt that familiar flutter in her chest. Not anxiety, exactly, but awareness. The same sensation she'd learned to trust when a customer's order felt wrong, or when Shadow's posture shifted just before trouble arrived. Tonight, though, it carried a different note. Not warning, but anticipation. As if the evening air itself was holding its breath. "Helen Lighthall, as I live and breathe." She turned to find Sheriff Mike Arrington striding toward them, his uniform crisp despite the heat, a smile creasing the corners of his eyes. At 58, Mike carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world, though Helen suspected that confidence had been hard-won during his years working Chicago's streets before trading city crime for Maplewood's considerably gentler mysteries. "Sheriff," she said, noting how Halo immediately sat for attention while Shadow offered a more reserved tail wag. "Working or playing tonight?" "Both," Mike admitted, scratching behind Halo's ears. "Fair brings out the best in people, but also let's call it, most creative. Last year, Mrs. Henderson tried to sneak her prized rooster into the pie contest. Did she win? The rooster or the pie? Because the answer's yes to both." Helen laughed, the sound carrying more easily than it had in months. Retirement had been kind to her in many ways, but she'd missed the daily rhythm of community, the small dramas and celebrations that made a town feel alive. They walked toward the midway, passing clusters of teenagers trying to look nonchalant, while clearly plotting their evening's romantic strategies, and families with sticky-fingered toddlers already sporting the glazed expressions that meant someone was going to crash spectacularly before 9 o'clock. "I was thinking of giving you the official tour," Mike said, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent Helen couldn't quite place. "Make sure you don't miss anything interesting." There it was again, that flutter of awareness, stronger now. She glanced at Mike's profile, noting the way his eyes swept the crowd with professional habit. "Should I be concerned about something?" "Probably not," he said, but his pause suggested otherwise. "Just keeping an eye on things. They paused at a striped tent tucked between the popcorn wagon and a booth selling hand-tooled leather belts. The sign read, Madame Rosa, seer of fortunes, reader of palms, teller of truths in elaborate script, decorated with painted stars and moons that managed to look both mystical and slightly gaudy. The woman standing at the tent's entrance commanded attention without trying. Madame Rosa appeared to be in her late 50s, with silver-streaked black hair wound into an elaborate bun and secured with what looked like genuine vintage hairpins. Her purple shawl caught the evening breeze, revealing glimpses of intricate embroidery, and her dark eyes, outlined in kohl that somehow enhanced rather than overwhelmed her features, swept the passing crowd with the calculating gaze of someone who made her living reading people. Helen was studying the tent's theatrical setup when voices from inside caught her attention. Rosa stood facing a man Helen recognized as Vince Calder, the carnival's owner, a handsome man in his late 40s whose easy charm had won him friends throughout the county, but whose smile tonight seemed strained around the edges. "Debt's coming due, Rosa," Vince was saying, his voice low but carrying an edge that made Halo's ears prick forward. "We can't keep putting this off. People are starting to ask questions." Rosa's response was equally quiet but edged with steel. "Some debts aren't paid with cash, Vincent. You, of all people, should understand that." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Helen felt that flutter in her chest intensify. This wasn't a simple argument about rent money. There were layers here, histories and secrets that ran deeper than carnival bookkeeping. Vince's jaw tightened. "This conversation isn't over." "No," Rosa agreed, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that sent a small chill down Helen's spine. "I don't imagine it is." Mike had moved on, apparently missing the exchange, but Helen lingered just long enough to see Rosa's expression shift as she noticed her. The fortune-teller's calculating look softened into a professional smile, but not before Helen caught a glimpse of something harder underneath, the look of someone who collected secrets the way other people collected stamps. "Curious about your future, dear?" Rosa called out, her accent carrying hints of somewhere far from Maplewood. "I think I'll leave that as a surprise," Helen replied pleasantly, but she filed away the woman's face, the tent's location, and the distinct feeling that Madame Rosa was someone who bore watching. As they moved deeper into the fair, Helen noticed other details that might have escaped a casual observer. The way the cotton candy vendor's smile didn't quite reach his eyes when he served certain customers, the clusters of people who seemed to be having serious conversations in the spaces between game booths, the overall sense that beneath the surface cheerfulness, undercurrents of tension ran like hidden streams. They were passing the Ferris wheel when it happened. A breeze touched her cheek, cool and unexpected in the warm evening air, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle despite no flowers visible anywhere nearby. The sensation was so distinct, so purposeful, that Helen stopped walking and turned. Halo's leash tugged gently in her hand, and she followed his gaze to see a figure standing motionless near Rosa's tent. Too far away to make out details, but something in the person's stillness, the way they stood apart from the flowing crowd, watching rather than participating, caught her attention like a discordant note in a familiar song. The figure seemed to sense her attention and melted into the crowd so smoothly, it was as if they'd never been there at all. "Helen," Mike's voice seemed to come from a distance. She blinked, realizing she'd been staring at empty space. "Sorry. Thought I saw someone I knew." But as they continued toward the food stalls, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen someone she knew, or rather, someone who knew her. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead, that flutter in her chest settled into something calmer, more certain. "Whatever's coming," she thought, watching Shadow's alert posture as he scanned the crowd. "I won't be facing it alone." The Ferris wheel turned against the darkening sky, its lights beginning to compete with the first stars, and Helen Lighthall walked deeper into an evening that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. By the time the fireworks began, Madame Rosa would be dead, and Helen would find herself at the center of a mystery that proved sometimes the most dangerous secrets were hidden in plain sight, spinning like a carnival wheel against the summer stars. Chapter 2: The Final Reading. The fair had transformed as darkness settled like velvet over Maplewood. What had been cheerful and bright an hour ago now pulsed with an almost electric energy, the rides outlined in neon jewels against the star-pricked sky. The air had cooled just enough to carry scents further: barbecue smoke, caramel apples, and something Helen couldn't quite identify that made Shadow's nostrils flare with interest. She was standing near the bandstand, watching couples sway to the brass quartet's rendition of Moonlight Serenade, when May's voice cut through the music like a bright bell. "There you are!" May Jacobs appeared in a swirl of her signature floral skirt and jangling silver bracelets, her cheeks flushed with excitement and the warm night air. At 62, May had the energy of someone half her age and the curiosity of an investigative reporter, a combination that had gotten them both into trouble more than once over their 40-year friendship. "I thought you were coming by later," Helen said, noting how Halo immediately launched into his full-body wiggle dance, while Shadow offered May his more dignified version of enthusiasm. "Later came early when I smelled Mrs. Patterson's cinnamon almonds," May admitted, linking arms with Helen in the effortless way of old friends. "You know me, I have the impulse control of a hummingbird around sugar." Helen smiled, but something in May's energy felt different tonight. Beneath her usual cheerful chattiness was an undercurrent of restlessness, as if she were looking for something to happen. Helen had learned to read her friend's moods like weather patterns, and tonight's forecast suggested May was brewing up some kind of adventure. They walked deeper into the midway, past the ring toss where a teenage boy was trying to impress his girlfriend with increasingly dramatic failures, and the milk bottle game, where the operator's patter had taken on the hypnotic rhythm of a carnival barker from another era. "Oh, look at that!" May stopped so suddenly that Halo walked into her legs. She was staring at Madame Rosa's tent, which seemed even more theatrical now that full darkness had fallen. Colored lights had been strung around the entrance, and the scent of sandalwood incense drifted from within, mixing with something floral that Helen couldn't quite place. "A fortune-teller! Helen, this could be exactly what I need." Helen felt that familiar flutter of unease. "May, you know how I feel about—" "Oh, pish," May waved a dismissive hand. "It's all in good fun. Besides, look at her, she's got the whole mysterious woman thing down perfectly. The shawl, the jewelry, those eyes. I bet she tells the most wonderfully dramatic fortunes." Helen studied the tent more carefully this time. There was something about it that bothered her, though she couldn't put her finger on what. The setup was professional. Too professional for a small county fair. The silk hangings, the genuine antique furniture visible through the open flap, even Rosa's jewelry looked expensive rather than costume. This wasn't someone playing dress-up for summer carnival work. "May, I really think this is a bad idea," Helen said, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "There's something about her that doesn't sit right with me." "That's exactly why I want to do it," May replied, already drifting toward the tent. "Sometimes you need a little mystery in your life, Helen, a little possibility." The word hung between them, and Helen realized this wasn't really about fortune-telling. May had been restless lately, talking about feeling stuck, wondering if retirement meant the best parts of life were behind them. A fortune-teller promising glimpses of the future would appeal to someone looking for reassurance that adventures still lay ahead. 10 minutes, May promised, squeezing Helen's arm. "I'll ask about lottery numbers and tall, dark strangers. You can wait out here with the boys and practice your skeptical expressions." Before Helen could protest further, May had disappeared through the tent flap, leaving Helen standing outside with both dogs. Halo settled with patient resignation, but Shadow remained standing, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the tent that Helen couldn't see. The tent's interior was dimly lit, probably by oil lamps judging by the warm, flickering quality of the light. Helen could hear the soft murmur of voices, May's bright chatter giving way to Rosa's lower, more measured tones. "Cross my palm, dear." Rosa's voice carried clearly in the still night air, rich with an accent that definitely wasn't local. Helen found herself leaning slightly closer, despite her better judgment. The rustle of fabric suggested May was settling into a chair, followed by the distinctive whisper of cards being shuffled. Helen had played enough bridge to recognize the sound of someone who handled cards with professional skill, quick, precise movements that spoke of years of practice. "You have questions," Rosa continued, her voice taking on a different quality, deeper, more theatrical. "But the answers are not all yours to find. I see danger." Helen's pulse quickened. Fortune tellers always predicted danger. It was part of the standard repertoire, vague enough to apply to anything from a stubbed toe to a car accident. But something in Rosa's tone suggested she wasn't following a script. "Danger rides high above you," Rosa continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A wheel will turn twice before the truth is revealed. Trust the one who stands in shadow, for they will guide you when the lights go dark." The words sent a chill down Helen's spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. She glanced at Shadow, who had gone completely still, his attention now focused entirely on the tent. There was a long pause before May spoke, her voice smaller than usual. "What does that mean? The wheel turning twice?" "The wheel of fortune, dear. The wheel of fate. It turns for us all, but some rides are more perilous than others." Another pause, filled with the distant sounds of the fair, children's laughter, the mechanical music from the carousel, the pop of air rifles from the shooting gallery. Normal sounds that somehow felt muted, as if the tent existed in its own bubble of consequence. Is there anything else?" May asked. "Only this. Beware the one who smiles with honey on their lips, but carries poison in their heart. Trust your instincts, and those of your friends. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those who pretend to be allies." Helen's unease crystallized into something sharper. This wasn't the usual fortune teller patter about love and money and distant relatives. Rosa was giving specific warnings, speaking as if she knew something concrete about May's future, or about threats that might be coming. When May emerged a few minutes later, her face was pale despite her forced smile. "Well, that was atmospheric," she said, but her voice lacked its usual bounce. "What did she tell you?" Helen asked, studying her friend's expression. "Oh, you know," May said with a shaky laugh, "mysterious mumbo-jumbo about wheels and shadows and people with honey on their lips, probably just her standard spiel for making things sound dramatic." But Helen could see the way May's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bracelets, the way her eyes kept darting back toward the tent. Whatever Rosa had said, it had shaken her more than she was admitting. They had barely taken 3 steps away from the tent when the world exploded into motion. A spotlight from the bandstand came loose from its mounting, the heavy metal fixture swaying dangerously above the walkway. Helen heard the groan of stressed metal, saw the light beginning to fall toward the exact spot where they had been standing. Without warning, Halo gave a sharp, urgent tug on his leash, pulling Helen 2 full steps to the right. The spotlight crashed down exactly where they had been walking, metal and glass exploding across the packed earth with a sound like breaking thunder. Fairgoers scattered, children screamed, and a worker rushed over, his face white with panic. "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry! The bracket must have— Are you ladies hurt?" "We're fine," Helen managed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knelt to give Halo a firm scratch behind the ears, her hands shaking slightly. "Thanks to this boy here." But even as she said it, Helen's mind was racing. The timing had been too perfect, too precise. Halo was smart, but he wasn't psychic, and the way he'd pulled her, not gradually, but with sudden, decisive force, suggested he'd been responding to something. Some signal or instinct she hadn't noticed. May was staring at the wreckage, her face even paler than before. That was exactly where we were standing," she whispered. "A wheel will turn twice," Helen murmured, the words spilling out before she could stop them. May's eyes snapped to hers. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Helen said quickly, but her mind was churning. Rosa had mentioned wheels, and here was the first turn, literal this time, as the spotlight's mounting bracket had given way. But if there were to be 2 turns, Shadow gave a low, almost inaudible whine, his body tense as he stared back toward Rosa's tent. Following his gaze, Helen saw Rosa herself standing at the tent's entrance, watching them with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. As they moved toward the first aid station, more for appearances than actual need, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had just taken a sharp turn toward something darker. Rosa's fortune hadn't been random predictions designed to separate May from her money. They had been warnings. And if the fortune teller was right about wheels turning twice, then this near miss was only the beginning. The question that haunted Helen as they walked deeper into the fair was simple but chilling. What would happen when the wheel turned the second time? The answer, she suspected, would come sooner than any of them were prepared for. Chapter 3: Death on the Midway. The fireworks began with a single silver streak that painted the night sky in brilliant white before exploding into a cascade of sparks. A collective "ah" rose from the crowd as children pointed skyward, and couples drew closer together, faces upturned to catch the magic raining down from above. Helen stood with May just off the main walkway, the dogs pressed close to her legs, their ears twitching with each thunderous boom. Halo had never quite adjusted to loud noises, but he tolerated fireworks with the resigned patience of a dog who understood that sometimes humans needed to make the sky explode for reasons beyond canine comprehension. Shadow, ever the protector, positioned himself where he could watch both the crowd and the surrounding darkness, his body a coiled spring of vigilant energy. The second rocket screamed upward, a whistling trail of gold that burst into a perfect chrysanthemum of light. For a moment, the entire fairground was illuminated in harsh detail. The upturned faces of the crowd, the skeletal outlines of ride machinery, the canvas peaks of vendor tents swaying gently in the evening breeze. That's when Helen noticed the first flicker. It was subtle, a momentary dimming of the string lights that outlined the midway, as if the fair had collectively blinked. She might have dismissed it as her imagination, but Shadow's ears pricked forward at the same instant, his attention shifting from the crowd to something Helen couldn't see. The third firework burst in emerald green, and this time the power fluctuation was unmistakable. The lights dimmed, held for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, then surged back to full brightness with an electric hum that made the hair on Helen's arms stand up. "Probably just the extra load," May said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that matched Helen's own unease. "All these rides and lights running at once." Helen nodded absently, but her attention had been drawn to Madame Rosa's tent. Even from their position 50 yards away, she could see the warm glow of lamplight through the striped canvas, a steady beacon of gold in the kaleidoscope of flashing carnival bulbs. There were shadows moving within, suggesting Rosa was with a client, conducting business even as the sky exploded in celebration above them. The fourth firework launched with a shriek that seemed louder than the others, drowning out the nervous whicker of horses in the livestock barn, and the distant cry of a baby startled awake. As it reached its apex and burst into a fountain of blue and silver, every light on the midway died. The darkness lasted only 3 seconds, but in that brief window of blindness, Helen heard something that made her blood turn to ice, a scream. Not the delighted shriek of someone on the tilt-a-whirl or the mock terror of teenagers trying to impress each other. This was raw, primal, the sound of someone in genuine distress, cut short so abruptly it might have been a knife severing vocal cords. The lights blazed back to life, and Helen was already moving. "Stay with the dogs," she called to May, pressing both leashes into her friend's surprised hands. May's protest was lost in the general commotion, as confused fairgoers looked around, blinking in the restored illumination, most unaware that anything more serious than a power glitch had occurred. Helen pushed through the crowd with the focused determination of someone who had spent years navigating the breakfast rush at her bakery. A group of teenagers blocked her path, laughing and pointing at the sky. She slipped around them. A family with a stroller was moving slowly ahead. She found a gap and squeezed through. The closer she got to Rosa's tent, the more her instincts screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The lamp inside no longer flickered with movement. It sat perfectly still, casting static shadows on the canvas walls. The tent flap, which had been secured open for business all evening, now hung closed and oddly askew, as if someone had pulled it shut in haste. She reached the entrance just as another firework exploded overhead, painting everything in stark red light for an instant, before plunging back into the gentler glow of carnival bulbs. Helen paused at the threshold, every nerve alert, then pushed the flap aside and stepped into the tent. The smell hit her first. Sandalwood incense, yes, but underneath it something else. Something floral and cloying that seemed to coat the back of her throat like syrup. Honeysuckle, her mind supplied, though there were no honeysuckle vines anywhere near the fairgrounds. The sweetness was so intense it made her eyes water. The scene inside the tent looked like a photograph of violence frozen mid-action. The small round table where Rosa conducted her readings had been overturned, sending tarot cards cascading across the carpet in a waterfall of arcane imagery. A crystal ball lay shattered near the entrance, its fragments catching the lamplight like scattered stars. Crystals and brass figurines were strewn across the floor as if someone had swept them off their display shelf in a single violent gesture. And in the center of it all, half slumped against the far wall like a discarded marionette, was Madame Rosa. Helen's baker-trained eyes, accustomed to precise timing and careful observation, took in the details with clinical detachment, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Rosa's elaborate purple shawl was wrapped around her shoulders, but it had shifted to reveal the unnatural angle of her neck. Her silver-streaked hair had come loose from its pins, spilling across her face in dark waves. Her eyes were closed, and the kohl that had outlined them so dramatically was smudged, as if she had been crying or struggling. Helen dropped to one knee beside the fallen woman, her hand moving automatically to check for a pulse at Rosa's wrist. The skin was already cooling, the kind of coolness that spoke of minutes past, not seconds. No flutter of life, no faint rhythm of a heart still fighting, just the terrible stillness that meant Rosa's last reading had been her own death. "Mike!" Helen called, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard over kitchen chaos. "Mike! I need you here now!" Footsteps pounded on the packed earth outside, heavy, purposeful strides that could only belong to Sheriff Mike Arrington. He appeared in the tent entrance like a force of nature, his hand already moving to the radio on his shoulder, his trained eyes taking in the scene with the same systematic precision Helen had used. "Oh, no," he breathed, then keyed his radio. "This is Sheriff Arrington. I need the coroner and the crime scene team at the fairgrounds immediately. We have a suspicious death." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Suspicious death. Not an accident, not a medical emergency. Murder. "What happened?" Mike asked, moving carefully around the overturned furniture to kneel beside Rosa's body. "I heard a scream during the fireworks," Helen said, backing away to give him space while keeping her eyes on the scene. "When the lights went out, I came straight here and found her like this." Mike checked for vital signs with the thoroughness of someone who had done this too many times, then shook his head. "She's been dead at least 10 minutes, maybe more." "During the fireworks," Helen murmured, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Perfect timing, everyone's attention on the sky, the noise covering any sounds." "Don't touch anything," Mike warned, rising and speaking into his radio again. "I need deputies to secure this area and start taking statements from anyone who was near this tent in the last hour." But Helen was no longer listening to his instructions. Her eyes had found something that made her breath catch in her throat. A brass charm in the shape of a wheel, half buried in the dirt near the overturned table. It was small, delicate, the kind of thing that might have fallen from a bracelet or been torn from a necklace during a struggle. She didn't touch it. Mike's warning had been clear, but she memorized its position, the way the lamplight caught its surface. The fact that it seemed oddly out of place among Rosa's usual mystical paraphernalia. A commotion outside drew their attention. May's voice rose above the general hubbub, sharp with worry. "Let me through!" "That's my friend in there." Mike moved to the tent entrance, his body blocking the view from curious onlookers who had begun to gather. "Crime scene," he said firmly. "I need everyone to step back." But Helen remained focused on the interior of the tent, her mind cataloging details the way she had once memorized recipes. The honeysuckle scent was strongest near Rosa's body, as if it had been deliberately placed there. The overturned table suggested a struggle, but Rosa's jewelry was still intact, her silver bracelets, her elaborate earrings, even what looked like an expensive ring on her right hand. This hadn't been a robbery. Outside she could hear the dogs barking, not in distress, but in the alert, focused way that meant they sensed something important. Shadow's bark in particular had a quality she'd learned to recognize. He had found something or someone worth attention. As Mike coordinated with his deputies and the crime scene photographer began setting up equipment, Helen found herself thinking about Rosa's fortune from earlier in the evening. A wheel will turn twice before the truth is revealed. The spotlight had been the first turn, an accident that wasn't really an accident, a warning wrapped in near disaster. And now here was the second turn. Rosa herself, silenced forever, with a brass wheel charm marking the spot where her killer had stood. The fortune teller had known something was coming. The question that would haunt Helen through the long night ahead was simple but terrifying. Had Rosa known she was predicting her own death? As the coroner's van pulled onto the fairgrounds and the last of the fireworks faded into memory, Helen stood at the edge of the crime scene and felt the weight of certainty settle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. This was no random act of violence. Someone at this fair, someone walking among the cotton candy and carousel music, was a killer, and they had just gotten away with murder in plain sight, hidden by fireworks and the happy chaos of a summer night. Chapter 4: The Cast of Suspects. The livestock barn had been transformed into an impromptu interrogation center. Its usual occupants, prize-winning cattle and nervous 4-H sheep, relocated to make room for a very different kind of livestock, suspects in a murder case. The air still carried traces of hay and animal warmth, but now it was overlaid with the sharp scent of human anxiety and the metallic tang of fear. Helen stood at the edge of the cordoned area, May beside her clutching both dog leashes with white knuckles. The fairgrounds beyond the barn had taken on an surreal quality, rides still turning their lazy circles, music still playing from the carousel, but now punctuated by the red and blue flash of police lights and the low murmur of fairgoers being questioned by deputies. "I count 5, May whispered, nodding toward the cluster of people waiting near the feed stalls. 5 people who look like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Helen studied each face in turn, her mind automatically cataloging details the way she had once memorized the preferences of regular bakery customers. These weren't just random fairgoers caught up in police procedure. Each person in that group radiated the particular tension that came from having something to hide. Sheriff Mike emerged from behind a hay bale where he'd been conferring with the coroner, his expression grim. He caught Helen's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, their signal that she was welcome to observe, but only if she remained invisible. He approached the first suspect with the measured gait of someone who had conducted hundreds of interviews, his notebook ready, his demeanor professional, but not unkind. Vince Calder separated himself from the group with the fluid confidence of a man accustomed to being in charge. Even under these circumstances, he carried himself like someone giving a performance, shoulders back, easy smile at the ready, though Helen noticed the smile never quite reached his eyes. "Vince," Mike began, "when did you last see Rosa alive?" "About an hour before the fireworks started," Vince replied, his voice carrying just the right note of cooperative concern. "We had a business discussion about her rental situation." Helen felt May stiffen beside her. They both remembered the heated exchange they'd witnessed earlier, the undercurrent of threat that had nothing to do with simple rent collection. "Business discussion," Mike repeated neutrally. What exactly was discussed? Vince's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rosa was behind on her payments. I reminded her that carnival space costs money and that I couldn't keep making exceptions just because she'd been with the circuit for years. "You raised your voice," Mike observed. "Maybe a little." Vince's hands moved restlessly, adjusting his belt, straightening his already straight collar. "Look," Rosa was difficult. She had opinions about how things should be run, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. But raising your voice and committing murder are two very different things. Where were you during the fireworks? Checking the ride inspections with my crew. Half a dozen people can verify that. We had to make sure everything was secure before tomorrow's opening. Vince's answer came too quickly, too smoothly, like something he'd rehearsed. Helen made a mental note. Alibi prepared in advance. Mike moved to the next suspect, a woman whose nervous energy was visible from across the barn. Tina Marsh looked exactly like what she was, a small business owner who had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of candy apple creation and wasn't about to let anyone, living or dead, interfere with her livelihood. Her blonde hair was escaping from its ponytail, and her apron still bore the sticky evidence of a busy night at the booth. Tina, I understand you and Rosa had some ongoing disagreements. Disagreements? Tina's voice rose half an octave. She told people my apples were cursed, said they would cloud your judgment and lead you down dark paths. Do you have any idea what that kind of talk does to business? When did you last speak with her? 2 days ago, when I told her to keep her fortune-telling nonsense away from my customers. But I saw her tonight, right before the fireworks. She was heading toward her tent with that smug look she always wore when she thought she knew something the rest of us didn't. Helen noticed the way Tina's hands moved constantly, wiping at stains that weren't there, adjusting her hair, fidgeting with her jewelry. Classic signs of someone with a guilty conscience or a nervous disposition. The question was which. Where were you during the fireworks? At my booth, where I always am. Ask any of the high school kids working for me. I had 3 of them dipping apples right up until the finale. Tina's voice carried a note of desperation that made Helen's instincts prickle. The third suspect required Mike to look up, way up. Gregory Pike towered over everyone else in the barn, his 6'4" frame made even more imposing by years of physical labor that had built him into a human wall of muscle and quiet menace. Helen had heard whispers about Gregory since he'd started working the Ferris wheel. Something about time served downstate, though no one seemed to know exactly what for. Gregory, Mike said, craning his neck to meet the man's eyes. You operate the Ferris wheel. That's right. Gregory's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Been doing it all summer. No complaints, no problems. When did you last interact with Rosa? Gregory's pause was just a fraction too long. Can't say I interacted with her much at all. Maybe nodded when I passed her tent, but that was about it. Helen caught the evasion immediately. Can't say wasn't the same as didn't, and she had the feeling Gregory was someone who chose his words very carefully. Where were you during the fireworks? Up in the wheel with a full load of passengers, 8 people, all wanting the best view of the show. Check your ticket stubs if you want. I can give you names. Mike scribbled in his notebook. The wheel ever stop during the show? Another pause, and this time Helen saw something flicker across Gregory's face. Not quite fear, but calculation. Once or twice, maybe. To let people get a better look at the big finale. Standard procedure. Helen's mental alarm bells started ringing. Once or twice meant he had left his post, even briefly. And in her experience, men who'd learned to be careful with words in prison didn't qualify their statements unless they were hiding something significant. The fourth suspect was a study in barely contained indignation. Harriet Cole stood with the rigid posture of someone who considered this entire situation beneath her dignity. As president of the Maplewood Historical Society, she was accustomed to being the one asking questions, not answering them. Her white blouse remained immaculate despite the barn setting, and her pearls caught the overhead lights with each sharp movement of her head. Sheriff Arrington, she said before Mike could speak, I hope you understand that my time is quite valuable. The Historical Society has a board meeting tomorrow morning, and I still have preparations to complete. I appreciate your cooperation, Harriet. When did you last see Rosa? I avoid fortune tellers on principle, Harriet replied crisply. Charlatans preying on the desperate and gullible. However, I did observe her earlier this evening near the historical exhibits, where she had no business being. What was she doing there? Harriet's lips pursed as if she'd tasted something unpleasant. "Taking photographs, if you can believe it, of our displays, our documentation. When I asked what she thought she was doing, she had the audacity to tell me she was researching local history for a client." Helen and May exchanged glances. Rosa had been investigating something specific, something that involved Maplewood's past. "Where were you during the fireworks?" "In the horticulture hall with the garden club committee, awarding the Dahlia Cup. 12 witnesses, Sheriff, all of them pillars of the community." The final suspect was the youngest, and possibly the most nervous. Eli Weston looked like he wanted to disappear into the hay bales. At 18, he had the gangly awkwardness of someone still growing into his height, made worse by the magician's assistant costume that now looked more ridiculous than mysterious. His bow tie hung loose around his neck, and his dark hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it. "Eli," Mike said gently, recognizing the kid's distress, "I know this is scary, but I need you to tell me about your relationship with Rosa." "She thought I stole from her," Eli blurted out. "Last week she accused me of taking her lucky coin. I didn't, I swear I didn't. But she wouldn't believe me, and she said she was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was." "What kind of coin?" "Silver, with some kind of symbol on it. She said it was connected to a reading she did for someone important, someone who'd paid her a lot of money to keep their secrets." Helen's pulse quickened. Rosa had been collecting secrets, using them as leverage. That opened up a much wider field of potential killers. "Where were you during the fireworks?" "Backstage with Mr. Marvolo, practicing the dove trick for tomorrow's show. We've got it on video for social media. You can check the timestamp." As Mike finished with the formal interviews, Helen found herself studying the group as a whole. 5 people, 5 different motives, 5 alibis that might or might not hold up under scrutiny. But more importantly, she was beginning to see the pattern that connected them all. They were all afraid of something Rosa knew. Vince feared exposure of whatever financial irregularities were hiding behind his carnival operations. Tina was terrified of losing her livelihood to Rosa's malicious gossip. Gregory had a past he clearly wanted to keep buried. Harriet was protecting something related to local history or her own involvement in it, and Eli was scared of being branded a thief at 18 before his life had really begun. Rosa hadn't just been a fortune teller. She'd been a collector of secrets, and someone had decided her collection had become too dangerous to allow her to keep. As the suspects were released with stern warnings not to leave town, Helen caught Mike's attention. "They're all lying about something," she said quietly. "I know," Mike replied, his expression grim. "The question is whether any of them are lying about murder." Shadow chose that moment to give a low, rumbling growl, his attention fixed on the barn side entrance. Through the gap in the boards, Helen caught a glimpse of someone watching, too far away to identify, but close enough to make her skin crawl. The killer was still out there, possibly still at the fair, and Helen had the uncomfortable feeling that they were now being watched as carefully as they were watching others. The wheel had turned twice, just as Rosa had predicted, but Helen was beginning to suspect the fortune teller's prophecy wasn't finished yet. Chapter 5: Secrets in the Sawdust. Morning came to the fairgrounds like a reluctant witness, pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself was uncertain about illuminating the scene of last night's violence. The carnival that had pulsed with life and music just 12 hours ago now sat in eerie silence, its rides motionless, its game booths shuttered, the very air seeming to hold its breath. Helen stood at the edge of the midway with Halo and Shadow, watching Sheriff Mike's deputies move between the stalls like ghosts in uniform, their voices low and their movements careful. The crime scene tape around Rosa's former tent site fluttered in the morning breeze, a yellow reminder that death had visited paradise and left its mark. May had gone home after giving her statement, shaken by the night's events and needing the comfort of her own kitchen and familiar routines. But Helen found herself drawn back to the fairgrounds, pulled by an invisible thread of curiosity and something deeper, a sense that Rosa's secrets were still here, waiting to be discovered by someone with the patience to look. "Can't stay away, can you?" Mike's voice carried a note of weary amusement as he approached, coffee cup in hand, his uniform already showing the wrinkles of a long night, followed by an early morning. "The dogs needed a walk," Helen replied, which was true enough, though it skirted the larger truth that she needed to understand what had happened here. "Besides, I brought reinforcements." She held up a paper bag from Sunrise Bakery, the sweet scent of fresh cinnamon rolls wafting out. Mike's expression softened marginally. The universal law that baked goods could smooth even the most official interactions. "My deputies are going to think you're trying to corrupt them," he said, accepting the bag. "I'm retired, not dead," Helen replied. "And besides, corruption implies they're getting something they shouldn't have. Everyone deserves a decent breakfast, especially people working a murder case." Mike studied her face for a moment, reading the determination there. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Would you, if it were your case?" He sighed, the sound of a man who recognized an immovable force when he encountered one. "Rosa's belongings are in evidence storage. We'll go through them when we can, but you've got other cases, limited resources, an affair that needs to open today if the vendors are going to make their rent money," Helen finished. "I understand." What she didn't say, but what they both knew, was that she had something Mike didn't: time, curiosity, and a lifetime of experience reading people and situations that didn't quite add up. 20 minutes later, Helen found herself in the sheriff's evidence garage, ostensibly delivering cinnamon rolls to the deputies cataloging Rosa's possessions. The space smelled of motor oil and dust, but underneath those familiar scents was something else: the lingering trace of sandalwood and that strange honeysuckle that seemed to follow Rosa even in death. Rosa's trunk sat on a metal workbench, its brass fittings tarnished with age, but still solid. It was larger than Helen had expected, the kind of piece that spoke of a woman who had traveled extensively and carried her entire life with her. The deputies had opened it and laid out the contents in neat rows: silk scarves in jewel tones, several decks of tarot cards in various stages of wear, crystals and small brass figurines, and enough costume jewelry to stock a small theater company. But Helen's attention was drawn to something the deputies had missed, or perhaps hadn't recognized as significant. The trunk's interior was lined with fabric that didn't quite lay flat against the bottom. She ran her fingers along the edge, feeling for irregularities, until she found it: a slight warping in one corner where the wood had swelled with age. "Deputy Morrison," she called to the young officer cataloging evidence. "Could you help me with something? I think there might be a false bottom here." Morrison approached with the careful enthusiasm of someone still new enough to the job to find evidence exciting rather than routine. Together, they examined the trunk's construction until Morrison found the tiny catch hidden beneath a brass corner piece. The false bottom popped up with a soft creak, revealing a space just deep enough to hide a slim volume bound in cracked leather. Helen's pulse quickened as Morrison carefully lifted out the book. It was unmarked on the outside, but the leather was supple from handling, and the pages fell open naturally when Morrison set it on the workbench. "Whoa," Morrison breathed, staring at the contents. The book was a ledger, but unlike any accounting record Helen had ever seen. Page after page of entries in Rosa's flowing handwriting: names, dates, amounts of money, and symbols that looked like playing card suits. But more intriguing were the notes written in margins: cryptic phrases that suggested Rosa had been tracking far more than simple business transactions. Helen leaned closer, reading over Morrison's shoulder. One entry made her blood run cold: VC, $300, Spade. The state inspector never saw the real maintenance records. Another, dated just 3 days ago: HC, $150, diamonds. Great-grandfather's land deal wasn't exactly legal. Mineral rights still contested. And then, in an entry that made Helen's stomach drop: RCV, personal, heart. Some names are worth dying for. RCV. Rosa's own initials, if her real name was indeed Rosalind C. Varga, as Helen suspected. Rosa had been keeping secrets about herself, secrets she considered worth the ultimate price. "This isn't just bookkeeping," Morrison said, his voice hushed. This is blackmail, Helen finished. Rosa wasn't just telling fortunes. She was collecting information and selling silence. She turned the page and found more entries, each one a small window into the dark corners of Maplewood's supposedly peaceful community. Gregory Pike's name appeared multiple times, always with large amounts and the spade symbol. Eli Weston was listed with smaller sums but more frequent entries. Even May's name appeared once, though the notation beside it was different. MJ, no charge, heart. Friendship has its own currency. Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Rosa had been investigating May as well, but had chosen not to exploit whatever she'd found. The heart symbol seemed to indicate personal rather than business relationships, the people Rosa cared about enough to protect rather than pursue. We need to bag this as evidence, Morrison said, reaching for a plastic evidence envelope. Wait, Helen said, her eyes catching on something else. Tucked between the pages was a torn piece of cardstock, half of a playing card, the black spade and partial number still visible. The edges were worn soft, as if it had been carried for a long time before being placed here. That's the other half, Morrison said, pointing to an evidence bag on the nearby shelf. We found part of a card in the tent last night. Helen studied both pieces, her mind racing. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the evidence bag. Morrison hesitated, then carefully removed the card fragment and held it up next to the piece from the ledger. They fit perfectly, two halves of the ace of spades, one of the most symbolically loaded cards in the deck. Death card, Morrison said quietly. Or a calling card, Helen murmured. Someone wanted Rosa to know they were coming for her. She was about to ask Morrison to turn to the ledger's final entries when a shadow fell across the garage entrance. Helen looked up to see Sheriff Mike silhouetted against the morning light, his expression unreadable. Find something interesting? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Rosa's real business records, Helen replied, stepping back from the workbench. Mike, she was blackmailing half the county. This ledger, it's a map of everyone's secrets. Mike approached the table, his movements careful and deliberate. As he scanned the open pages, Helen watched his expression shift from professional interest to something much more personal and troubling. How many people knew about this book? He asked. Hard to say, but someone knew enough to leave her half of a death card as a warning. Helen pointed to the torn ace of spades. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment killing, Mike. Someone planned this, probably for weeks. Mike closed the ledger gently, as if it were an explosive device. This stays between us for now. Morrison, not a word about the contents until I give you clearance. Yes, sir, Morrison replied, but Helen caught the excitement in his voice. The young deputy had just gotten his first real taste of a complex investigation, and it was clearly intoxicating. As Mike secured the ledger in an evidence locker, Helen found herself thinking about the entry under Rosa's own initials. Some names are worth dying for. Had Rosa known her real identity was in danger? Had she been trying to protect someone else's secret, or hide her own? A sudden gust of wind blew through the open garage, carrying with it the faint scent of honeysuckle. Impossible here, blocks away from the fairgrounds, but unmistakable nonetheless. Halo's tail began wagging for no apparent reason, while Shadow stood perfectly still, his attention focused on something beyond Helen's perception. She felt that familiar flutter of awareness, stronger now than it had been since this whole investigation began. Rosa's secrets were only the beginning. The ledger was a key, but to what door? And why did Helen have the growing certainty that she was being guided toward answers that someone very dangerous, desperately wanted to keep buried? As they left the evidence garage, Helen glanced back once at the workbench where Rosa's life had been laid out in neat rows. Somewhere in those silk scarves and tarot cards and brass figurines was another clue, another piece of the puzzle that would explain why a fortune-teller had to die to keep her prophecies from coming true. The wheel had turned twice, just as Rosa predicted, but Helen was beginning to suspect that the turning wasn't finished yet, and the next rotation might be the most dangerous one of all. Chapter 6. Ferris Wheel at Midnight. The fairgrounds after dark on the second night felt like a completely different world from the crime scene Helen had left that morning. The rides were running again, life and commerce demanded it, but there was a subdued quality to the laughter, a nervous edge to the conversations. People clustered closer together, glanced over their shoulders more often, and the shadows between the game booths seemed deeper and more threatening than they had before Rosa's death. Helen stood at the base of the Ferris wheel, watching its pastel gondolas turn their lazy circles against the star-drunk sky. Each revolution took approximately 4 minutes. She'd been timing them for the past 20 minutes, studying the ride's rhythm, the operator's habits, the brief moments when the wheel paused to load and unload passengers. Gregory Pike stood at the controls, his massive frame silhouetted against the ride's carnival lights. From this distance, he looked like any other carnival worker, focused on his job, professional, unremarkable. But Helen had read Rosa's ledger entries about him, had seen the amounts of money he'd paid to keep his secrets buried. Those numbers told a story of desperation, of a man who had far more to lose than a summer job operating rides. "You planning to ride, or just memorize the engineering?" Helen turned to find Mike approaching, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and an expression that suggested he knew exactly what she was doing here. "The dogs needed another walk," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The night air carried a chill that hadn't been there the evening before, and the warmth felt good in her hands. "Right," Mike said dryly. "And I suppose it's just coincidence that you're studying our prime suspect's workplace at midnight." Helen watched Gregory help an elderly couple into a gondola, his movements gentle despite his intimidating size. He could have left his post during the fireworks. The wheel stops, people are looking at the sky, he climbs down for 3 minutes. 3 minutes to get to Rosa's tent, kill her, and get back without anyone noticing, Mike finished. It's possible. Tight timing, but possible. "I want to see what he could see from up there," Helen said, nodding toward the wheel's peak. Rosa's tent, the livestock barn, the paths between. If Gregory was planning something, he would have scouted it first. Mike studied her face in the carnival lights. "And you think riding the Ferris wheel at midnight is going to give you some kind of revelation?" "I think," Helen said carefully, "that Rosa told May to trust the one who stands in shadow. And I think sometimes you have to get above the shadows to understand them." Shadow, as if summoned by his name, pressed closer to Helen's leg and gave a soft woof of agreement. Halo was more interested in the lingering scent of cotton candy drifting from a nearby booth, but even he seemed more alert than usual, his golden head turning to track movements in the crowd. Gregory had noticed them, Helen realized. His eyes kept flicking toward their small group, and there was something in his posture, a tension that suggested he was very aware of being watched. When the elderly couple's gondola reached the loading platform, he helped them out with the same gentle care, but his movements had acquired an edge of urgency. "Miss Lighthall?" Gregory's voice carried across the short distance, surprisingly soft for such a large man. "You want to ride?" It wasn't really a question, more like a challenge. Helen felt that familiar flutter of awareness in her chest, the sensation that had become her internal compass for moments when the universe was about to shift in significant ways. "Yes," she said, handing Halo's leash to Mike. "I think I do." The gondola swayed slightly as Helen settled onto the bench, the metal cool under her palms despite the warm evening. Gregory secured the safety bar with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the relative quiet of the ride area. For just a moment, their eyes met through the wire mesh of the gondola, and Helen saw something flicker across his features, not quite fear, but calculation. The look of a man weighing options, measuring risks. "Enjoy the view," he said, his voice neutral, but Helen caught the undercurrent of something that might have been warning. The wheel shuddered into motion with a mechanical sigh, and Helen began her ascent into the night sky. At first, the rise was gentle, almost soothing, the fairground spreading out below her like a living map, the paths and booths and rides connected by streams of light and movement. But as she climbed higher, the perspective shifted, and Helen began to see patterns that were invisible from ground level. Rosa's former tent site was clearly visible from the wheel's midpoint, marked by the crime scene tape that still fluttered in the evening breeze. But more important was what surrounded it. Clear sight lines from multiple directions, several paths that would allow quick approach and escape, and, Helen's pulse quickened, a perfect view of the livestock barn's rear entrance. As the gondola reached the wheel's apex, Helen could see the entire fairground layout spread beneath her like a strategic map. The barn sat at the fair's edge, where the carnival lights gave way to the darker fields beyond. Behind it, barely visible in the shadows, was a storage area where vendors kept supplies and equipment. It would be the perfect place for a clandestine meeting, private, accessible, but far enough from the main crowds to avoid casual observation. The wheel began its descent, and Helen used the changing angle to study the paths between the rides. Someone could move from the Ferris wheel to the barn's rear area in less than 2 minutes if they knew the route and weren't concerned about being seen. During fireworks, with everyone's attention skyward, it would be even easier. But as her gondola descended past the midpoint, Helen noticed something that made her breath catch. 2 figures stood in the shadow of the livestock barn, half hidden behind a feed wagon. From ground level, they would be completely invisible. From the Ferris wheel's height, they were clearly visible, and clearly trying to avoid being seen. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller and more agile. Even in the poor light, their body language suggested an intense conversation, heads close together, hands moving in sharp, emphatic gestures. Helen strained to see more details, but the wheel's motion carried her past the optimal viewing angle before she could identify the figures. When her gondola reached the bottom, Gregory was waiting to help her out, but instead of the routine politeness she expected, his dark eyes held a question, and something that might have been concern. "See anything interesting up there?" he asked, his voice carefully casual. Helen stepped out of the gondola, her mind racing. Gregory was asking because he knew there was something to see. The question was whether he was warning her away from it or testing to see what she'd observed. "Beautiful view," she replied neutrally. "You can see the whole county from up there." Gregory's expression didn't change, but Helen caught the slight relaxation in his shoulders. He'd been genuinely worried about what she might have seen, which meant there was definitely something worth seeing. "Mind if I go again?" Helen asked, keeping her tone light and conversational. "I'd like to take another look at the stars. You don't get perspective like that from ground level." For a moment, Gregory hesitated. Then he nodded and gestured toward the gondola. "Sure thing. Quiet night for business anyway." But as Helen climbed back into the seat, she noticed Gregory glance toward the barn area before starting the wheel again. It was a quick look, almost unconscious, but it confirmed what she'd suspected. He knew about the meetings happening in that shadowy space behind the barn. The second trip up gave Helen a better view of the area beyond the barn. The 2 figures were still there, but now they were moving, walking toward different exits from the fairground. Even in the darkness, Helen could see that they were being careful to leave separately, taking different paths to avoid being seen together. As her gondola reached the peak again, a cool breeze stirred her hair, that familiar, purposeful touch that she'd learned to recognize as more than natural wind. It carried the faint scent of honeysuckle, impossible at this height, but unmistakable nonetheless. And with it came a moment of perfect clarity. Rosa hadn't been killed for the blackmail alone. She'd discovered something about these midnight meetings, something worth killing to protect. The fortune teller had been in the business of collecting secrets, but she'd stumbled onto one that was too dangerous to buy, sell, or trade. When the wheel brought Helen back to ground level, she found Mike waiting with both dogs, his expression tense. "Learn anything useful?" he asked. "Yes," Helen said, accepting Halo's enthusiastic greeting while Shadow pressed close to her side. "But I think I also learned that someone's going to great lengths to keep certain conversations private." She glanced back at Gregory, who was helping another passenger into a gondola with the same careful attention he'd shown everyone that night. But now Helen could see the performance in it. The way he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to multiple areas of the fairground. The subtle alertness that suggested he was watching for more than just customers. "Mike," she said quietly, "I think we need to have another conversation with Gregory Pike, but not here and not now. He's been expecting us to figure out he could leave his post during the fireworks. The real question is what he was supposed to be watching for while he was up there." As they walked away from the Ferris wheel, Helen felt the weight of being observed. Not by Gregory, his attention was focused on his passengers, but by someone else, someone in the shadows beyond the carnival lights. The same watching presence she'd sensed before, but stronger now, more immediate. The wheel turned against the star-filled sky, its lights reflecting in the dark windows of the empty vendor booths. And Helen realized that Rosa's murder was just the beginning. Whatever secret was worth killing to protect was still out there, still dangerous, and still very much in play. The fortune teller had warned May that a wheel would turn twice, but Helen was beginning to suspect that Rosa's prophecy had been incomplete. Some wheels, once they started turning, didn't stop until they'd crushed everything in their path. Chapter 7. Ledger of Lies. The sheriff's station felt different at 3 a.m, hollow and echoing, filled with the kind of silence that made every footstep sound like a gunshot. Helen sat at Mike's desk, the photocopied pages of Rosa's ledger spread before her like tarot cards revealing a future none of them wanted to see. The original was locked safely in evidence, but Mike had grudgingly allowed her to work with copies after she'd pointed out that she might recognize patterns that would be invisible to someone who hadn't lived in Maplewood for 30 years. "You should go home," Mike said from the doorway, holding 2 cups of what could generously be called coffee. "Get some sleep. This will all still be here in the morning." "Sleep's overrated," Helen replied, accepting the coffee, despite knowing it would taste like liquid disappointment. "Besides, I'm starting to see connections that I missed before." She'd been at this for 2 hours, ever since the fair closed, and Mike had finally agreed that Rosa's ledger was too complex to decode without help. What had looked like random blackmail at first glance was revealing itself to be something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. Helen spread the pages in chronological order, tracing Rosa's entries from her first week in Maplewood 3 months ago to her final entry, dated the day before her death. The pattern that emerged made her stomach clench with dread. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of entries from Rosa's first month. She starts small, minor infractions, embarrassing secrets. Tina Marsh's candy apples contain artificial flavoring despite her all-natural claims. Harriet Cole had an affair with the mayor 20 years ago. Eli's family is 3 months behind on their mortgage. Mike leaned over her shoulder, studying the neat handwriting. "Standard fortune teller information gathering. Find out people's vulnerabilities. Use them to seem psychic." Exactly. But then look what happens in month 2. Helen flipped to later pages. The amounts get bigger, the secrets get darker, and she starts using a new symbol. She pointed to a series of entries marked with small triangles instead of the usual playing card suits. Next to each triangle was a single letter, C. "What's the C stand for?" Mike asked. "That's what's been bothering me." Helen pulled out a separate sheet where she'd been tracking the coded entries. "At first I thought it meant cash or complete, but look at the timing. Every entry marked with a triangle and a C corresponds to a major decision made by the town council, the fair board, or the historical society." Mike's expression darkened as he followed her logic. "You think she was selling information to influence local politics?" "I think she was doing something worse than that." Helen turned to the ledger's final pages, where Rosa's handwriting became increasingly urgent, the entries shorter and more cryptic. "Look at this, from last week." She pointed to an entry that made her pulse quicken every time she read it. "CM, $500. They know I know. Contract expires with the fair. Need exit strategy." "CM," Mike repeated. "Carnival money? Maybe. Or maybe C stands for something else entirely." Helen pulled out her notebook where she'd been tracking patterns. What if C doesn't refer to the payment method? What if it refers to who she was working for? She spread out her timeline of events, cross-referenced with the ledger entries. Rosa arrives in Maplewood 3 months ago, right when the county is deciding whether to renew the fair's 5-year lease on the municipal grounds. She starts collecting information on the key decision-makers: Harriet Cole from the Historical Society, Vince Calder, who owns the carnival, even Gregory Pike, who knows things about fair operations that outsiders wouldn't. Mike sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk. You're saying she was working for someone with a vested interest in the fair's future? I'm saying she was working for someone who needed to make sure the right people made the right decisions. Helen tapped the triangle entries. Every time there was a crucial vote or permit approval, Rosa had fresh dirt on the people involved. Coincidence? Not likely. Mike scrubbed his face with his hands. But who would have that kind of reach? Who benefits from controlling the fair's lease renewal? Helen had been thinking about that question for the past hour, and the answer that kept surfacing made her deeply uncomfortable. Someone who stands to lose a lot of money if the fair moves to a different location. Someone who's invested too much in this particular arrangement to let it slip away. She pulled out the copies of the fair's lease documents that Mike had obtained from the county clerk's office. The current lease was indeed up for renewal, and there had been some discussion about moving the fair to a larger location outside the county, one that could accommodate more vendors and bigger crowds. The fair employs a lot of people, Mike said slowly. Local suppliers, security, cleanup crews, if it moves away. A lot of people lose their livelihoods, Helen finished, but some people lose more than others. She turned to a page near the back of Rosa's ledger, where the entries became more personal and less coded. RCV, personal and heart. Starting to understand why M was so insistent about this job. The stakes are higher than carnival revenue. Need to document everything in case something happens to me. M, Mike said quietly. Someone gave Rosa this job specifically. Someone who knew the information she gathered would be valuable. Helen felt that familiar chill run down her spine. And Rosa figured out that she wasn't just collecting secrets for blackmail. She was gathering intelligence for someone with a bigger agenda. She pulled out the final entries, the ones that had kept her awake for the past hour. Entry number 127. Discovered the real purpose tonight. The triangle payments aren't just about the fair. There's a development deal waiting in the wings. If the fair stays, certain properties can't be rezoned. If it goes, those same properties become worth millions. Entry number 128. Found the connection between the council votes and the property acquisitions. Land that was supposed to stay agricultural is quietly being purchased by shell companies. The fair renewal is just the first domino. Entry number 129, final. They suspect I know too much. C called tonight, wanted to meet. Told him I'm done, want out. He laughed and said some contracts can't be broken. Need to tell someone what I've learned, but who can I trust? The corruption goes higher than I thought. The silence in the sheriff's office stretched until it felt like a living thing. Helen stared at the final entry, Rosa's last words in her own handwriting, and felt the weight of truth settling around them like a shroud. She wasn't just blackmailing individuals, Helen said quietly. She stumbled onto a conspiracy to manipulate local government decisions for a massive development project. The fair renewal was just the beginning. Mike stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark streets of Maplewood. And when she tried to get out, they silenced her. But not before she documented everything. Helen gathered the papers, her mind racing ahead to the implications. Mike, if Rosa was right about the development scheme, then her murder wasn't just about protecting individual secrets. It was about protecting a multi-million-dollar land deal. Which means, Mike said, turning back to face her, that whoever killed Rosa has a lot more to lose than we thought, and a lot more resources to make sure they don't lose it. Helen was about to respond when Shadow, who had been sleeping quietly in the corner, suddenly lifted his head and gave a low, warning growl. His ears were pricked forward, his attention focused on something beyond the window. "What is it, boy?" Helen asked. But Shadow was already on his feet, padding to the window where Mike stood. Mike peered through the blinds, then quickly stepped back. Car in the parking lot, engine running, no lights. Helen felt her pulse spike. How long has it been there? Don't know, but whoever it is, they're watching the station. Mike reached for his radio. Unit 7, this is base. I need a patrol to swing by the station, check out a suspicious vehicle in the south lot. The radio crackled with static, then went silent. Unit 7, respond, Mike repeated, but got only silence in return. Helen gathered Rosa's papers, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had spent years organizing under pressure. Mike, I think we need to assume that whoever killed Rosa knows we're here, knows what we're doing, and has people watching to make sure we don't get too close to the truth. Shadow's growl deepened, and through the window Helen caught a glimpse of movement in the parking lot. Multiple figures, moving with the purposeful coordination of people who had done this before. Back exit, Mike said tersely, checking his weapon. Now. As they moved toward the rear of the building, Helen clutched Rosa's ledger copies to her chest and realized that the fortune teller's final prophecy was still unfolding. The wheel had turned twice, but the game wasn't over. It was just entering its most dangerous phase. And Helen was beginning to understand that in this particular game, the stakes weren't just individual secrets or small-town scandals. They were millions of dollars, corrupt government officials, and a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple county fair. Rosa had died because she'd learned too much. The question now was whether Helen would live long enough to make sure Rosa's truth finally saw daylight. Chapter 8, A Narrow Escape. The rear exit of the sheriff's station opened onto an alley that Helen had never paid attention to before. A narrow strip of cracked asphalt between the station and the old Methodist church, lined with dumpsters and forgotten enough that most people drove past without noticing it existed. Tonight, that anonymity felt like a lifeline. Mike moved ahead of her with the careful, controlled steps of someone who had learned urban tactics the hard way during his Chicago years. His weapon was drawn but held low, and he paused at each shadow, each corner, each place where danger might be waiting. Helen followed, clutching Rosa's ledger copies against her chest like a shield, while Halo and Shadow flanked her with the focused alertness of dogs, who understood that this was no longer a game. The night air carried sounds that shouldn't have been there, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, the metallic click of something that might have been a car door, or might have been something worse, and underneath it all, the low murmur of voices coordinating in the darkness. How many? Helen whispered, her breath coming shorter than she would have liked. At least 3 vehicles, Mike replied, without turning around. Maybe 8 people total. Professional operation. The words sent ice through Helen's veins. 8 people didn't come together at 3 a.m. for a casual conversation. 8 people suggested planning, resources, and the kind of commitment that came with having a lot to lose. They reached Mike's patrol car, parked behind the station, in the slot reserved for the sheriff. Mike tested the door handle, then pulled out his keys with movements so careful they barely made a sound. But as he inserted the key into the lock, Shadow's low growl made them both freeze. The dog was staring at something under the car, his hackles raised, his body tense with the particular alertness that meant immediate danger. Mike dropped to one knee and shined his phone's flashlight under the vehicle. "Helen!" he breathed, then grabbed Helen's arm. "Move! Now!" They backed away from the car, at a speed that tried to balance urgency with silence, but Helen's imagination was already filling in the details Mike hadn't shared. Car bombs were the stuff of action movies and international terrorism, not small-town sheriffs and retired bakers. But Rosa's ledger had made it clear that the stakes here were far beyond anything Maplewood had ever seen. "The church," Mike whispered, pointing toward the Gothic silhouette of the Methodist building. "Sanctuary." They moved toward the church's rear entrance, a heavy wooden door that Helen knew would be locked. But as they approached, she noticed something that made her pulse spike. The door was standing slightly ajar, its ancient hinges probably too warped to hold it completely closed. Mike tested the opening with one finger, pushing it just wide enough for them to slip through. The interior of the church was cavern dark, filled with the familiar scents of old wood and hymnal pages, and something else. Something sweet and floral that made Helen's breath catch. Honeysuckle. It was impossible, illogical, and absolutely unmistakable. The same scent that had marked every significant moment in this investigation, now leading them into what should have been the safest place in Maplewood. They moved through the church's narthex into the main sanctuary, where tall windows filtered moonlight through stained glass, painting the pews in patches of color that looked almost like bloodstains in the darkness. Helen had attended services here for 20 years, had helped with bake sales and holiday decorations and the annual rummage sale, but tonight the familiar space felt like foreign territory. Mike was checking the front entrance when Helen heard it, the soft whisper of the rear door opening again. Someone had followed them inside. Shadow's growl was barely audible, but Halo pressed closer to Helen's legs with the kind of trembling that suggested he knew they were being hunted. Helen grabbed both dogs' collars, holding them close, trying to think of sanctuary spaces within the sanctuary. The church had a small office behind the altar, she remembered, and a storage room that connected to the Sunday school wing. Multiple exits, multiple hiding places, and, she hoped, a landline phone that would work even if cell service had been compromised. They moved toward the altar, with steps that seemed impossibly loud against the wooden floor, despite their efforts at silence. Behind them, Helen could hear the soft sounds of someone moving through the church with far more confidence than visitors should have. Someone who knew the layout, who had perhaps been here before. Mike reached the office door first and tested the handle. Locked. He pulled out what looked like a credit card and worked at the lock with the kind of skill that reminded Helen he'd had a very different career before coming to Maplewood. The lock clicked open just as a flashlight beam swept across the sanctuary behind them. Helen caught a glimpse of two figures moving between the pews, not searching randomly, but heading directly toward the altar area as if they knew exactly where their targets would try to hide. They slipped into the office and Mike closed the door behind them with infinite care. The room was small, cramped with filing cabinets and a desk that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, but it had what Helen had hoped for, an old rotary phone sitting on the desk like a relic from a more civilized age. Mike lifted the receiver and Helen heard the blessed sound of a dial tone, but as he began to dial, the office door rattled. "Sheriff Arrington?" The voice was male, calm, and terrifyingly reasonable. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Mike finished dialing and spoke in a whisper so low Helen had to strain to hear. "This is Sheriff Arrington. I need backup at the Methodist Church on Main Street. Armed intruders. Immediate response required." The voice outside the door continued with the same reasonable tone. "We're not here to hurt anyone, Sheriff. We just need those papers your friend found. Rosa left some things that don't belong to her, and we'd like them back." Helen clutched the ledger copies tighter. These people knew exactly what they were looking for, which meant they'd been watching the investigation from the beginning. The thought that Rosa's killers had been monitoring every step of the investigation made her feel violated in a way that went beyond simple fear. "There's another way out," Mike whispered, pointing to a second door that Helen had assumed was a closet. "Sunday school wing, connected to the fellowship hall." The door handle turned. They moved through the second door just as the office door opened behind them, slipping into a hallway that Helen remembered from years of church potluck dinners and holiday pageants. The Sunday school wing was a maze of small classrooms and storage closets, built in an era when churches were designed to accommodate large, extended gatherings. Behind them, she could hear voices, at least 3 people now, coordinating their search with the efficiency of professionals. These weren't random thugs or desperate amateurs. They moved like people who had done this before, who knew how to corner prey and eliminate witnesses. Mike led them through the Sunday school maze toward what Helen hoped was the fellowship hall's exit. But as they rounded a corner, Shadow's warning growl made them freeze again. Someone was coming from the opposite direction, cutting off their escape route. They were trapped between 2 groups in a building that had suddenly become a labyrinth with no safe passages. That's when Helen heard it. A sound so unexpected in their current circumstances that for a moment she thought she was hallucinating. Shadows bark, but not from beside her. The sound was coming from outside the building, loud and persistent, and very definitely calling for attention. "What the heck?" she whispered, looking around to confirm that Shadow was still pressed against her leg. But the barking continued, joined now by what sounded like Halo's distinctive whine. Impossible sounds from impossible sources, but growing louder and more insistent by the second. The voices of their pursuers shifted, becoming confused, uncertain. Footsteps moved toward windows, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. In the confusion, Mike grabbed Helen's arm and pulled her toward a door she hadn't noticed, an exit that led directly into the church parking lot. They emerged into the night air, just as the first police sirens became audible in the distance. The parking lot was empty except for Mike's backup cruiser, but the impossible barking continued, seeming to come from all around them and nowhere at once. "Run!" Mike said, and they ran. They reached the backup cruiser as the first patrol cars rounded the corner, their red and blue lights painting the church walls in emergency colors. Helen threw herself into the passenger seat while Mike started the engine, and they pulled away just as armed figures emerged from the church's main entrance. As they drove toward the safety of the downtown area, Helen finally found her voice. "Mike, who was that barking?" "I don't know," Mike replied, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "And right now, I don't care. Someone was watching over us tonight, and I'm not going to question the method." Helen looked back at the church, now surrounded by police cars and flashing lights, and felt the familiar brush of cool air across her cheek. The honeysuckle scent was gone, but the sense of protection remained, stronger now than it had ever been. Shadow pressed his nose against her hand, solid and real and reassuringly alive, while beside him, Halo's tail wagged with the satisfied air of a dog who had somehow helped save the day. Rosa's ledger was still safe in Helen's arms, its secrets intact. But Helen was beginning to understand that protecting those secrets would require more than luck and more than human help. The wheel was still turning, and the most dangerous revolution was yet to come. Chapter 9, The Clues Align. Dawn broke over Maplewood like a hesitant witness, pale and uncertain, as if the sun itself wasn't sure it wanted to illuminate what had happened during the night. Helen sat in the secure conference room of the county sheriff's office, 20 miles outside Maplewood, where Mike had insisted they retreat after the church incident, surrounded by evidence boards, coffee cups, and the accumulated weight of a conspiracy that grew more terrifying with each piece that fell into place. Her kitchen table detective work seemed almost quaint now. The conference room walls were covered with photocopied ledger pages, crime scene photographs, property records, and a web of string-connecting names, dates, and locations that looked like something from a television thriller. But this wasn't entertainment. This was the systematic dismantling of everything she'd thought she knew about her hometown. "Tell me again about the barking," Mike said, refilling her coffee cup with the dedication of someone who had given up on sleep entirely. "I know how it sounds," Helen replied, though she'd stopped trying to rationalize what had happened in the church. Shadow was right beside me, but his bark was coming from outside. Same with Halo. It was like they were in two places at once. Mike nodded as if supernatural intervention was just another item to add to his incident report. Whatever it was, it saved our lives. Those men weren't there to negotiate. Helen studied the evidence board, trying to see the pattern that she knew was there. Rosa's ledger entries, cross-referenced with property records and voting histories, told a story of systematic corruption that made her stomach clench with betrayal. But more than that, they told the story of how a fortune teller had stumbled into something far more dangerous than blackmail. "Look at this timeline," she said, pointing to a series of dates marked in red. Rosa arrives in Maplewood in March. In April, the town council votes to delay the fair lease renewal for further study. In May, 3 key properties adjacent to the fairgrounds are quietly purchased by something called Meridian Development Corporation. Mike joined her at the evidence board. "Shell company?" "Has to be. I called the state business registry this morning. Meridian was incorporated just 2 months ago, with a mailing address that traces to a law firm in the state capital." Helen traced the timeline with her finger. June, Harriet Cole's Historical Society suddenly discovers concerns about the fair's environmental impact. July, Vince Calder starts having financial difficulties that threaten his ability to maintain the carnival. And Rosa documented all of it, Mike said grimly. Every vote, every property purchase, every convenient crisis. Helen turned to the ledger entries she'd been studying since sunrise, the ones that had kept her awake even after their miraculous escape. But here's what I missed before. Rosa wasn't just recording what was happening. She was tracking the pattern of who benefited. She pulled out a legal pad covered with her handwriting, connections drawn between names and amounts that had taken her hours to decipher. Every time the fair lease got delayed, property values around the fairgrounds dropped. Every time there was a crisis that threatened the carnival's future, someone swooped in with a solution that came with strings attached. Mike leaned closer, studying her analysis. Someone was manipulating the market. Drive down property values, buy cheap, then clear the obstacles and watch the value skyrocket. Exactly, but it gets worse. Helen flipped to a page near the back of Rosa's ledger, one she'd almost overlooked in her earlier analysis. Rosa figured out that the fair renewal wasn't the endgame. It was just the first domino. She pointed to an entry dated just 1 week before Rosa's death. M finally explained the full scope. Fair renewal is cover story. Real goal is county rezoning for resort and conference center. Current fairgrounds plus adjacent properties equals 200-acre development site. Projected value, $50 million. The silence in the conference room stretched until Helen could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. $50 million was the kind of money that could buy entire town councils, silence inconvenient witnesses, and hire professional killers to clean up loose ends. Resort and conference center, Mike repeated slowly. On the fairgrounds. Think about it, Helen said, her mind racing ahead to the implications. Maplewood is perfectly positioned, close enough to the interstate for weekend getaways, far enough from the city to feel like an escape, historic downtown for charm, beautiful countryside for recreation. All it needed was the right kind of development. Mike walked to the window, staring out at the rolling hills that surrounded the county seat. And all that stood in the way was a county fair and the people who wanted to keep it. Helen felt that familiar chill, the one that came when pieces of a puzzle clicked into place in ways that revealed just how much danger everyone had been in without knowing it. Rosa didn't just stumble onto this conspiracy, Mike. She was hired specifically to help make it happen. She pulled out the entry that had been haunting her since she'd first read it. M recruited me because of my background. Said my special skills would be perfect for gathering the kind of information that people wouldn't normally share. Thought he meant fortune-telling. Now I understand he meant intelligence gathering. M, Mike said. We need to figure out who M is. I think I already have. Helen turned to a page she'd covered with notes and cross-references. Look at the property purchases again. Meridian Development Corporation, who would have both the resources to fund a shell company and the local knowledge to know which properties to target. Mike studied the property records, his expression growing darker with each page. Someone with access to zoning information, development plans, maybe even advanced knowledge of council votes. Someone who's been in Maplewood long enough to understand the local politics, but with enough outside connections to arrange this kind of financing. Helen felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. Someone who would benefit enormously from a major development project, but would need to stay in the background to avoid suspicion. She pulled out her phone and showed Mike the results of her morning research. Meridian Development Corporation. 3 board members listed in the state filing. 2 are lawyers from the Capitol, probably just front men, but the third... Mike read the name, and his face went pale. You have got to be kidding me. Mayor Bradley Hutchinson, Helen said quietly, who's been pushing hard for economic development and bringing new opportunities to Maplewood. Who would have advanced knowledge of all council votes and zoning decisions? Who would be in a perfect position to coordinate the property purchases and policy changes needed to make this work? The mayor of Maplewood, the man who had cut the ribbon at every fair opening for the past 8 years, who had promised prosperity and progress and small-town values. The man who had been systematically destroying the town's most beloved tradition so he could profit from its ashes. That's why Rosa was killed, Helen continued, the full picture becoming clear. She figured out that Mayor Hutchinson wasn't just involved, he was the mastermind. And when she tried to back out of the deal, he had her silenced. Mike walked back to the evidence board, studying the timeline with new understanding. So who killed her? Hutchinson himself? No, Helen said, turning to the ledger entries about Gregory Pike. But I think I know who did. She spread out the pages documenting Gregory's payments to Rosa, the amounts that had seemed too large for simple blackmail. Gregory wasn't paying Rosa to keep his past quiet. He was paying her to coordinate with Mayor Hutchinson's schedule. Look at the dates. Every payment corresponds to a town council meeting or zoning hearing. Mike's expression shifted from confusion to horrified understanding. Gregory was the inside man at the fair. He could move around freely, watch for problems, report back on conversations. And when Rosa became a problem, Gregory was perfectly positioned to eliminate her. Helen felt sick as the final pieces fell into place. During the fireworks, when everyone was looking up at the sky, Gregory could slip away from the Ferris wheel, kill Rosa, and be back at his post before anyone noticed. But why would Gregory risk murder for Hutchinson? Helen pointed to an entry she'd found buried in Rosa's notes. GP criminal record includes armed robbery, aggravated assault. Hutchinson somehow arranged early parole in exchange for community service. G doesn't know I found the connection. Hutchinson owns Gregory, she said quietly. Has since before he ever came to Maplewood. Gregory isn't just an employee, he's a convicted felon whose freedom depends on keeping the mayor happy. The conference room fell silent again as they both absorbed the full scope of what they'd uncovered. Not just murder, but corruption that reached from a small-town mayor to state-level development deals worth tens of millions of dollars. We need to move fast, Mike said finally. If Hutchinson knows we figured this out, and after last night he definitely knows we're close, he'll cut his losses and disappear. Helen was gathering the evidence when Shadow, who had been sleeping quietly in the corner, suddenly lifted his head and gave a low, warning growl. Through the conference room window, she could see a black sedan pulling into the parking lot, moving too slowly, windows too dark, everything about it screaming professional surveillance. Mike, she said quietly, I think we're about to find out just how far Mayor Hutchinson is willing to go to protect his $50 million secret. The wheel was still turning, and Helen realized with crystalline clarity that the most dangerous revolution was just beginning. Chapter 10. The Wheel Turns. The evening air at the Maplewood County Fair carried a different weight than it had 3 nights ago. What had once felt like innocent summer magic now hummed with undercurrents of deception and violence. Helen stood at the base of the Ferris wheel, its pastel gondolas turning their lazy circles above her head, each revolution marking time until the final confrontation she knew was coming. But tonight, she wasn't here as a victim or a target. Tonight, she was the hunter. The plan had taken shape in the county sheriff's office after they'd evaded the surveillance team, forged through hours of desperate strategy and the kind of calculation that came when running was no longer an option. They couldn't hide forever. Mayor Hutchinson had too many resources, too many connections, too much to lose. The only way to end this was to expose the conspiracy so publicly and completely that silencing her would be impossible. The fair was the perfect stage, public, crowded, symbolic, and the one place where all the players would be forced to gather for the final act of their elaborate deception. Helen adjusted the tiny recording device Mike had given her, hidden beneath her jacket, where even the most careful pat-down wouldn't detect it. She'd insisted on wearing a wire despite Mike's protests about the danger. If tonight went wrong, if Hutchinson's people managed to silence her permanently, at least the truth would survive. You ready for this? Mike's voice crackled through the nearly invisible earpiece she wore. He was positioned with backup officers around the fairground's perimeter, close enough to respond but far enough away to avoid spooking their targets. As ready as anyone can be for accusing the mayor of murder, Helen murmured, then louder. May, you're sure about this? May Jacobs stood beside her, clutching a printed flyer announcing Rosa's memorial reading, Final Messages from Beyond. They'd counted on May's reputation for theatrical enthusiasm to make the announcement believable, and judging by the curious crowd already gathering, the bait had worked perfectly. I've been spreading the word all day, May whispered. Everyone who was here the night Rosa died is coming. They think I'm going to channel her spirit and reveal her killer. Helen almost smiled at the irony. In a way, that was exactly what was about to happen. The crowd was larger than Helen had expected, drawn by the morbid curiosity that surrounded any public tragedy. She spotted familiar faces throughout the gathering. Tina Marsh looking nervous and checking her phone repeatedly, Harriet Cole standing ramrod straight with the expression of someone attending a distasteful but necessary social obligation, Eli Weston hovering at the crowd's edge like he might bolt at any moment. And there, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man certain of his welcome, was Mayor Bradley Hutchinson. Helen felt her pulse spike as she watched him work the gathering like the practiced politician he was. Handshakes, backpats, the carefully modulated sympathy voice he'd perfected during 20 years of public service. To the assembled fairgoers, he was their trusted leader, here to show support for the community in a time of tragedy. Only Helen knew he was actually here to assess the threat and eliminate it if necessary. Gregory Pike stood at the Ferris wheel controls, but tonight his attention wasn't on the ride. His dark eyes swept the crowd with predatory focus, and Helen noticed the way he positioned himself for clear sightlines to multiple exits. He wasn't here as a carnival employee. He was here as Hutchinson's enforcer, ready to clean up any problems that arose. "Ladies and gentlemen," May called out, her voice carrying the theatrical projection she'd learned from years of community theater. "Thank you for joining us tonight to honor the memory of Madame Rosa, whose tragic death has left our community with so many unanswered questions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Helen felt the weight of collective attention settling on their small group, and with it, the terrible responsibility of what came next. In the next few minutes, she would either expose a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of local government, or she would die trying. Rosa was a woman of many gifts, May continued, warming to her role. She could see truths that others missed, patterns that connected past and future, and in her final days, she left clues, messages that point to the real reason she died. Helen stepped forward, feeling the moment crystallize around her like ice forming on still water. Rosa didn't die because of blackmail or petty secrets, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. She died because she discovered a conspiracy to steal $50 million from this community. The crowd's murmur shifted, became something sharper and more dangerous. Helen saw Mayor Hutchinson's expression change, the practiced sympathy sliding away to reveal something much colder underneath. "That's quite an accusation, Helen," Hutchinson said, moving closer through the crowd. "I hope you have evidence to support such inflammatory claims." "I have Rosa's ledger," Helen replied, pulling out the photocopied pages. "Every transaction, every payoff, every step of your plan to destroy the county fair so you could redevelop this land into a resort." She held up the first page, reading aloud. "Meridian Development Corporation. Incorporated 2 months ago with Mayor Bradley Hutchinson as majority shareholder. Projected investment, $50 million in resort and conference center development on 200 acres, including the current fairgrounds." The crowd's attention was laser-focused now, the casual evening atmosphere replaced by something electric and dangerous. Helen could see the moment when people began to understand that this wasn't theater. This was an accusation of real crimes against their real mayor. "You hired Rosa to gather intelligence on the people who could block your development," Helen continued, her voice gaining strength. "You had her collect blackmail material on town council members, historical society officers, anyone who might oppose rezoning the fairgrounds." Hutchinson's face had gone carefully blank, but Helen caught the quick glance he exchanged with Gregory Pike. The message was clear. Handle this. And when Rosa figured out the real scope of your plan and tried to back out, Helen said, turning to face Gregory directly, you had her killed. Gregory's hand moved towards something at his waist, not quite a weapon, but the suggestion of one. That's a serious accusation to make without proof, he said, his voice carrying undertones of threat. I have proof, Helen replied, holding up another page from Rosa's ledger. Your criminal record, armed robbery, aggravated assault. You were serving 15 years until Mayor Hutchinson somehow arranged your early parole in exchange for community service. The crowd was backing away now, sensing violence in the air like animals before a storm. But Helen pressed on, knowing this might be her only chance to expose the truth. Rosa documented everything, she said, her voice carrying over the growing murmur of alarm. The property purchases, the vote manipulation, the systematic destruction of the fair's lease renewal process. She knew you were using her to gather intelligence, and when she tried to stop cooperating— Enough, Hutchinson said sharply, dropping all pretense of political charm. Gregory, escort Ms. Lighthall away from the crowd. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown. But Gregory's movement toward Helen was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze. Shadow's warning growl, low and menacing, and coming from directly behind Mayor Hutchinson. Helen looked around quickly and felt her heart stop. Shadow was beside her, pressed against her leg where he'd been all evening. But the growl was coming from somewhere else, somewhere impossible. You want to hear Rosa's final message? Helen asked, pulling out the last page of the ledger. She wrote it the night before she died. They suspect I know too much. C called tonight, wanted to meet. Told him I'm done, want out. He laughed and said some contracts can't be broken. The crowd had gone completely silent now, every word carrying in the still evening air. C for Calder? Helen asked, then shook her head. No, C for conspiracy. The same conspiracy that hired professional killers to silence me when I got too close to the truth. Hutchinson's mask finally slipped completely. You meddling pest, he snarled. You have no idea what you're interfering with. It was the confession Helen had been waiting for, recorded clearly by the device hidden beneath her jacket. But it was also the signal for violence to begin. Gregory moved toward her with the fluid grace of someone who had done this before, but he stopped short when Shadow stepped between them. Not the Shadow who had been beside Helen all evening, but another dog entirely, identical in every way, except for the faint shimmer around his edges that suggested he wasn't entirely there. The crowd gasped, and in that moment of supernatural impossibility, sirens began wailing from multiple directions as Mike's backup plan kicked into gear. Gregory Pike and Bradley Hutchinson, Mike's amplified voice carried across the fairground as police vehicles surrounded the area. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Rosalind Varga. As the arrest unfolded around her, Helen felt a cool breeze touch her cheek, gentle, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle, and unmistakably purposeful. Rosa's prophecy had been fulfilled. The wheel had turned twice. The truth had been revealed. And those who stood in shadow had indeed provided protection when it was needed most. The Ferris wheel continued its lazy rotation above them, its pastel lights reflecting in the gathering police cars, as the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy Maplewood finally crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. Justice, it seemed, sometimes came with supernatural assistance, and Helen Lighthall had learned that some guardian angels barked. Epilogue, sweet endings. 3 weeks later, the Maplewood County Fair felt like a completely different world. The same rides turned their familiar circles, the same vendors hawked their cotton candy and caramel apples, but there was something lighter in the air, as if a weight that no one had fully realized they were carrying had finally been lifted. Helen walked the midway on closing night, Halo and Shadow padding contentedly beside her, their leashes loose in her hands. The dogs seemed more relaxed too, their supernatural alertness replaced by the simple joy of summer evening exploration. Shadow still watched the crowd with his characteristic vigilance, but now it felt protective rather than urgent, guardian-like rather than warning of immediate danger. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and the slow process of healing that followed any community trauma. Mayor Hutchinson and Gregory Pike were both in federal custody, facing charges that ranged from conspiracy and fraud to murder. The FBI's investigation had uncovered corruption that reached far beyond Maplewood, with Meridian Development Corporation connected to similar schemes in 3 other counties. Rosa, Rosalind Camilla Varga, as they'd learned from her real identification, had been given a proper burial in Maplewood Cemetery, her headstone paid for by donations from fairgoers who had never met her but understood that she died protecting their community. The inscription read simply, "She saw the truth and spoke it, even unto death." Helen paused at the ring toss booth, where the same bored teenager was stacking bottles with the weary resignation of someone counting down the hours until the fair moved on to the next town. The game that had once seemed impossible now looked almost manageable. 3 rings, 3 bottles, a simple matter of trajectory and timing. "You sure you want to try that again?" Mike's voice carried amusement as he approached, 2 cups of fresh lemonade in his hands. "After your miraculous win last time, people might start thinking you have supernatural assistance." Helen accepted the lemonade with a smile that held secrets they both understood, but didn't need to discuss. "Maybe I've just been practicing." The truth was more complex and more wonderful than practice. In the weeks since Rosa's murder had been solved, Helen had noticed changes in herself, not dramatic, not obviously supernatural, but present nonetheless. Her instincts were sharper, her timing better, her ability to read people and situations enhanced in ways that felt like gifts rather than accidents. Whether it was the residual effect of her guardian angel's protection or simply the confidence that came from surviving genuine danger, she wasn't sure. And increasingly, she didn't care about the explanation. "Besides," she added, handing the booth operator her tickets, "someone needs to win something for the boys." The first ring sailed cleanly over the center bottle. The second landed with a satisfying thunk around the neck of the tallest prize post. The third, and Helen felt that familiar cool breeze across her cheek just as she released it, settled around the final bottle with the kind of precision that drew applause from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. "Winner picks any prize on the top shelf," the teenager announced with considerably more enthusiasm than he'd shown earlier. Helen studied the array of stuffed animals and finally pointed to an enormous golden retriever, so lifelike it could have been Halo's twin, complete with a red bandana and an expression of perpetual joy. "Perfect choice," Mike said as Helen handed the prize to Halo, who immediately began trying to carry it, despite the fact that it was nearly as large as he was. They walked toward the exit, past families loading sleepy children into cars and teenagers making the most of their last few hours of summer freedom. The fair would move on tomorrow, but Maplewood would keep its fairgrounds, permanently protected now by a conservation easement that prevented any future development schemes. "May said she saw you at Rosa's grave yesterday," Mike said as they reached the parking area. Helen nodded. "I wanted to thank her, and to let her know that her sacrifice meant something." What she didn't mention was the moment when she'd knelt to place fresh honeysuckle on Rosa's grave, and felt, just for an instant, a presence beside her. Not threatening or demanding, but simply grateful. It had lasted only seconds, but it had been enough to confirm what Helen had suspected. Some debts of gratitude transcended death itself. "Any word on the federal investigation?" she asked, changing the subject to safer ground. 3 more mayors indicted in similar schemes across the state. Turns out Hutchinson was small potatoes compared to some of the others. Mike's expression darkened briefly. "The FBI thinks we stumbled onto something that could have spread to dozens of communities if Rosa hadn't blown the whistle." They reached Helen's Subaru, where May was waiting with a picnic basket and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Perfect timing," May announced. "I brought sandwiches for a proper post-fair celebration. And I have news." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Good news or May's having another adventure news?" "Both, probably." May's smile was infectious. "The State Historical Commission wants to hire me as a consultant for investigating fraud in historical property claims." Apparently, my unique insight into community dynamics could be valuable for uncovering similar schemes. Helen felt a familiar flutter, not of warning this time, but of anticipation. May? Oh, don't worry, it's mostly research and interviews, nothing dangerous. But it does involve travel to some very interesting small towns with very suspicious development projects. Mike groaned. Tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. I'm thinking, Helen said slowly, that retirement is turning out to be much more interesting than I expected. She looked around the fairgrounds one last time, taking in the Ferris wheel's gentle rotation, the streams of families heading home with their prizes and memories, the vendors beginning the process of packing up for the move to the next town. 3 weeks ago, this place had been the site of corruption and murder. Tonight, it was simply what it had always been meant to be, a place where communities came together to celebrate the simple joys of summer. As they loaded the dogs and May's picnic basket into the car, Helen caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the parking area, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat pulled low, watching their group with the same careful attention she'd noticed on the fair's opening night. But this time, instead of melting into the shadows when she looked directly at him, the figure touched the brim of his hat in a small salute. Then, in the space between one blink and the next, he was gone. See something? Mike asked, following her gaze. Just saying goodbye, Helen replied. As they drove away from the fairgrounds, Helen felt a deep sense of completion settling over her. Rosa's murder had been solved, the conspiracy exposed, the community protected. Justice had been served, and the innocent had been kept safe. But more than that, she'd discovered something about herself, something that had perhaps always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. She had the ability to see patterns others missed, to find truth in the midst of deception, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. So, May said from the back seat, when do we start planning our next investigation? Helen caught Mike's eye in the rearview mirror. His expression suggested he was already resigned to whatever adventures lay ahead. Let's see what opportunities present themselves, Helen said diplomatically. After all, mysteries have a way of finding us when we're ready for them. Shadow gave a soft woof of agreement from his position by the window, while Halo continued to wrestle with his oversized prize. And somewhere in the evening air, carried on a breeze that smelled faintly of honeysuckle and summer promises, Helen could have sworn she heard the sound of a wheel turning, not the mechanical rotation of a Ferris wheel, but something larger and more purposeful. The wheel of justice, perhaps, or the wheel of fate, spinning toward whatever mystery would next require the attention of a retired baker, her 2 faithful dogs, and the guardian angel who watched over them all. After all, in a world where fortune-tellers could predict their own deaths and supernatural protectors manifested as impossible dog duplicates, who was to say what adventures might be waiting just around the corner? Helen Lighthall had learned to trust in things beyond the visible world, and that trust, she suspected, was about to lead her toward mysteries she couldn't yet imagine. The wheel was still turning, and she was ready for whatever came next.